So in the last class or last couple of lectures, we learned about consumer surplus, producer surplus. We learned how to measure consumer surplus, and we also learned how to measure economic welfare, which is nothing but the summation of consumer surplus plus producer surplus. However, in reality, price may not be always at the most efficient market determined price. Price can be rigged. For example, often there are scenarios where prices are set by some outside institutions. For example, there's a rent control policy in certain states or certain cities where to make the housing more affordable, they try to control the rent. That means rent cannot be set above certain price, which is called the price ceilings. So price ceiling is a case of rent control. On the other hand, there's something called the price floor, where you basically make sure that certain products are not sold below certain price. And the good example of price floor is the wage in the labor market. You can imagine minimum wage is kind of price floor because nobody is allowed to sell their labor below the minimum wage. Even the individuals are willing to sell it below the minimum wage because that would be against the law. So no buyer of labor, which is often the firms or companies, they cannot pay anybody below the minimum wage. So two examples here we are going to do is minimum wage and also rent control. So these are the scenarios when actually equilibrium or market is not in equilibrium. So something has gone wrong and we fail to achieve the equilibrium price. So let's start with the price ceiling. As I said, it's some legal maximum on the price at which a good can be sold. So somebody will not be allowed to sell their product at a price above that. So in this case, let's start with the equilibrium. So let's focus on this diagram. Let's call it diagram 1. And you can see the equilibrium price is somewhere here because this is the equilibrium in the market. So this is the equilibrium and price may be P1. And let's say this is the market for rentals, and as we know, maybe this price P1 for rent may be too high for some people in certain communities. So often what governments do, they try to reduce this rent by decree. That means they put a price ceiling or rent ceiling sometimes. Let's say government puts a rent ceiling at P2 here. So let's call it diagram 2, P2. Now, here's the problem. Problem was that if the market price was here, this is the equilibrium quantity, which can be, say, 1000 units of rentals. However, if the price is set well below, we know according to law of supply, if price is set below the market price, obviously nobody is willing to sell 1000 units. Maybe they are willing to sell 500 units. And this was our initial 1000. So if the price is only, rent is only P2, sellers are willing to rent only 500 units. But we all know from law of supply, if the price is set below the equilibrium price, then it will create excess demand. So what we have here, there's a demand for housing for almost, say, 1300 units here, because this is the demand curve. So what's happening here, because the price is artificially low, that means not everybody will be able to get a housing. On the other hand, there's an increase in surplus for the buyers. Now buyer surplus is this. In the old case, buyer surplus was only this much. On the other hand, there's a huge decrease in seller surplus. So seller surplus is now only this much. In the old case, seller surplus is this, which makes sense because biggest loser in this case would be the people who rent their homes, because they will not be able to charge higher rent, and the people who will be able to rent those things will be able to get huger benefit. Obviously, there are people who are willing to rent at even at higher price P1, but they are unable to do it, and this is called something called a deadweight loss. So deadweight loss is the loss to the group of people who are unable to buy it because the price is artificially set. So often deadweight loss is the cost to the society created by market inefficiency. Why this market is inefficient? Because price is artificially set below the equilibrium price. As a result, it created excess demand, and because there's an excess demand for certain goods, some buyers, that means renters, would be unable to rent even if they are willing to pay higher price, and obviously some sellers are unwilling to rent their place because price is too low. So it creates deadweight loss. A similar situation can arise when we have a price floor. That means a legal minimum on the price at which a good can be sold. And as I said, a good example of that would be minimum wage. So let's see again in this case, let's call it figure 1 and figure 2. So this is the equilibrium. Let's say this is the equilibrium wage W1, and at this, suppose 5,000 people will be employed, and government comes in, they set a minimum wage, put a price floor, so they put a price of W2. W2 is the wage 2, which is higher than W1. W1 is somewhere here, higher price. So what happens at higher price? There will not be many buyer for labor. That is, firms would not like to hire. They might hire only say 2,000 people, but there are many sellers. That means many people are willing to work this high prices. Sellers would be like 7,000, and this is the equilibrium 5,000 what we found before. So in this case, this is the buyer surplus, and this is the seller surplus, which is the surplus that's going to the labor who has jobs, and it creates inefficiencies, which is shown as deadweight loss. So deadweight loss is again the loss of society because market is not in equilibrium. So that's one of the reasons behind interventions in the market can be problematic. But that doesn't mean that we should not have policies. Rent control policies or minimum wage policies are extremely important, and we'll talk about the importance of those things under different scenarios. But one thing you have to recognize that not every market is perfect, because often there are a lot of wage fixing and price fixing happens. So just to avoid those kind of scenarios, it's much better to have policy in place which kind of protects the workers or the renters in different scenarios.